Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the keynote lecture of the Fictions of History Conference, the 6th Annual Conference in Critical Theory here at the Graduate Center. We'd like to welcome Stephen Greenblatt. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We hope you've enjoyed the conference so far, and we hope you'll join us tomorrow at the New York Public Library, right on 40th and 5th, where we'll be having additional sessions, including several sessions devoted to W.G. Sebald, and a roundtable featuring Mark Anderson, Daniel Kelman, and Judith Ryan. So we hope to see you tomorrow. This is the 6th Annual Critical Theory Conference, and I remember starting this back in 2012, and we wrote the call for papers, and I very optimistically called it the first Annual Critical Theory Conference, and here we are at 6. Yes, thank you. Thank you. This conference featured 75 presentations from scholars representing all academic career stages, from PhD students through instructors to full professors. And we have 20 panels this year on a wide array of topics, from the classics to the Renaissance to Native American literature to several special sessions on Sebald. And I am very pleased to say that every single one of those 20 panels is chaired by a member of the CUNY faculty. So many of you are here tonight. Yes, thank you. Many of you are here tonight. I just want to say thank you for your time and your expertise. We really do appreciate your being here with us. This conference was started in support of a proposed certificate program in critical theory here at the Graduate Center. After a long process, our certificate was finally approved in fall of 2014, and that makes us the newest certificate program here at the Graduate Center. But even though we are the newest, we are already the second largest, and we are the fastest growing at the Graduate Center. Thank you. Our program currently enrolls 163 students from 19 different departments across the humanities and social sciences here at the Grad Center. And just to give you an indication of how quickly we are growing, last year at the last Critical Theory Conference, I stood on this very stage and I announced that we were so excited to enroll 109 students. So we've had quite a big growth spurt this past year. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Andre Aciman.
Thank you so much, Claire. We're all very happy today. One thing that Claire said, but I want to specify, she said it took a while to create the critical theory certificate. It did take a while because there was a lot of contention, there was a lot of fighting and a lot of spiteful fighting, but we got it through, and these things, you never hear about them, but you know, they did scar us for a while, but we're happy that it's happening, and for the past 6 years, it's been terrific. I need to thank the Writers Institute, the Advanced Research Collaborative, the Office of Public Programming, the Doctors Student Council, and of course, a generous help from Constance Old in memory of her brother, Lloyd Old. Thank you all very, very much. We appreciate help, and if you think I'm being a bit subtle, I am trying not to be. The Critical Certificate Program is something that we simply came up with 5 or 6 years ago, and then we reinvented it time and time again because we felt that every department in this institution has critical theory or literary theory or some kind of theory, but these programs were never coordinated. And so what we wanted to do is to manage to synthesize the whole thing, and also to allow our students to take a certain number of courses in critical theory and to get a certificate towards that, which makes it very, very helpful for their future. We owe a lot of help to Jin Chang, one of our students, to Sarah Selman, another student, and of course to Claire Summers. Claire Summers was, in fact, I would like to call her the midwife of this program because she was persistent, committed, and extremely determined. And this is what we needed. So my only suggestion to Claire, if I may be personal for a moment, is please do not deposit your dissertation next year. Keep it hanging because we need you here. In addition to today's guest, we've been very lucky to have been having Harold Bloom here, Slavoj Žižek, Frederick Jameson, Homi Bhabha, Martin Hagland, and Jonathan Culler. All these people have come here and spoken as keynotes, and we're very, very happy. Which explains why it gives me a great deal of pleasure tonight to welcome Stephen Greenblatt, who is the John Cogan University professor at Harvard University. Stephen does not need any introduction, but let me put it this way, that if Herodotus is known today as the great-great-grandfather of history, Stephen is the father of new historicism, or as he might like to call it, cultural poetics. We would not have, I think, this discipline today if it weren't for Stephen Greenblatt. He is the recipient of a Pulitzer Prize, of a National Book Award for his book on Lucretius, and his book on William Shakespeare has been on the national bestseller list of the New York Times. Let me tell you, this is not a small feat. I have tried to be there. It has not worked. Let me also add this final note that this year's conference on the fictions of history was not just inspired by Stephen Greenblatt, but it was we would also like to think that it is dedicated to him. Thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Well, thank you to Andre Asseman, to Claire Summers, to all of you for being here. Thank you for the great honor of the invitation. I'm very much aware that Herodotus is also known as the father of lies, and it may have more bearing on my presence than I wish it to have. I am actually very much aware, honestly, that the theory part of my contribution to critical theory on this occasion is more implicit than explicit, and I will leave it to you, perhaps to the question period, to tease out some of the implications of what I'm about to talk about. The overarching context for my talk this evening is a book that I've been writing for some years now, and I'm now about to complete, a book about the story of Adam and Eve, a book about why the story had the remarkable life in our culture that it possessed, and specifically about the ways in which certain key figures invested themselves, body and soul, in it. To understand the life history of the first humans is to understand the centrality of the storytelling imagination in human culture, and to follow in mesmerizing detail the remarkable process through which a fictional creation took on the force of living reality. And just looking through the titles of the talks at this conference in the next few days, I realize how many people here are grappling with that set of questions, how fiction is realized, how reality is fictionalized. The three great monotheistic religions of the West, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all trace humankind to a single male and a single female. Their story, probably inscribed in the form we know it in the 6th century before the Common Era, and almost certainly dating from much earlier in the first millennium, is one of the most significant imaginative creations in recorded history. For though invented by one or more ancient storytellers whose identity must be forever unknown to us, Adam and Eve ceased to be inventions. On the contrary, they became for virtually everyone, from simple peasants to towering intellectuals, the actual primordial couple who stood at the inception of human life and whose actions, attested by Holy Scripture, had a decisive and indeed fatal impact upon the nature, history, and ultimate destiny of humankind. They were our founders, the origin of our species. For better and worse, they made us what we are. In the book of Genesis, though the account of Adam and Eve is very brief, In the modern edition of the King James Bible that sits on my desk, it occupies only about a page and a half out of 1,078. It seems to consist of two distinct strands loosely stitched together. The first strand, in Genesis chapter 1, provides an account of the creation of the human on the sixth day. And God created the human in his image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. This seems to be the equivalent of what in natural history collections throughout the world are called holotypes. Also known as type specimens, holotypes are the singular, officially recognized physical examples of an entire species. The human of the first chapter of Genesis is in effect the holotype of humanity. God authored this creature. Actually, scientists who identify new holotypes are called the people who author the holotype. God authored this creature and carefully introduced him, naked of course, what would you expect, on earth as the type specimen. When you contemplate him, you contemplate both the particular individual figure and the entirety of humankind. And then in the second and third chapters of Genesis, the creature that excited all of these speculations, the creature of the holotype, is gone. Instead, there are two separate primordial human figures, the man formed out of dust and the woman fashioned from the man's rib, and these humans are involved in a narrative. To understand the actual nature of our kind, Genesis now insists what is needed is not to examine a holotype, but rather to watch the first humans in action. We have to observe their relationship, scrutinize their choices, follow their trajectory, and ponder the outcome. For it is not the biological nature of humans now that determined their story, but their story, the choices they made, and the consequences of those choices that determined their nature. The earliest Jewish, Christian, and Islamic commentators on Genesis speak of the first humans in a variety of ways, sometimes as if they once actually existed, but very often instead as allegorical representations, mystical symbols, or shadowy emblems of human nature. For some rabbinical commentators, for example, Adam and Eve were aspects of a single person. Adam, the rational element of the individual, Eve, the emotional, passionate, and irrational element. Other early rabbis speculated that the original human created by God was a hermaphrodite, and that the reproduction that God intended for this creature was not the sexual reproduction we now experience. Still others suggested that Adam was a giant whose size so terrified the angels that he had to be shrunk down to a more modest dimension, and so on. There are many, many examples of this that survive from the Midrash Rabbah and other early texts. Only through a very long process did Adam and Eve come to be understood not simply as our symbolic antecedents, but also as our literal origin. Every detail of the biblical story was pored over with fascination, anxiety, and hermeneutical cunning. Through the combined imaginative labor of innumerable people of every social rank and every level of skill, our first grandparents, as they were called, gradually acquired a startling, uncanny solidity. Most relevantly for a conference on the fictions of history, Genesis chapters 2 and 3 came to be understood as a narrative of the primordial and quintessential historical event. Because of what they did, Adam and Eve are the couple whose life history shaped all life histories to follow, as genes are said to shape those who inherit them. Gradually, this history accumulated an enormous apparatus of support. Teachers endlessly repeated it, institutions rewarded believers and punished skeptics, artists vividly represented it, intellectuals teased out its nuances and offered competing interpretations of its puzzles. The interpretations were encoded in doctrines that had a direct impact on the lives of millions. The risk in focusing on the vast collective work that across many centuries and cultures fashioned Adam and Eve, the risk of the, how should we say, coral reef approach to the story, and it is a story built up out of tens of thousands of small interventions, hundreds of thousands of them over a vast period of time. The risk is that we lose a sense of the titanic bursts of energy that an occasion propelled the story violently forward in time. Perhaps the greatest of these came from St. Augustine, who devoted to the primal couple an obsessive, lifelong attention. Though this attention had deep personal roots, it was not a personal affair. Through the power of his sheer intelligence, as well as his institutional mastery, he committed Christianity to an embrace of the Hebrew origin story from which others had wished to distance themselves. In the 2nd century, the influential early bishop Marcion of Sinope, a very early bishop, he was born around 80 of the Common Era, Marcion had proposed that the church abandon the whole Hebrew Bible as the basis for faith in Christ. The God whose acts and intentions are recorded in the history of the Jews, he argued, is tainted by evil. A divinity who forbids humans access to knowledge in the Garden of Eden and then punishes them horribly for an act that only the possession of such knowledge could have prevented is not the pure, spiritual, holy, and good God whose spark redeemed Christians find within their own bosoms. The worship of Yahweh, Marcion, who was, as you might guess, not from a Jewish background, but a Gentile background, the worship of Yahweh should go the way of the cult of Marduk, Amun-Ra, or innumerable other gods swept away by the new revelation. But Marcion was denounced as a heretic. In the face of relentless persecution, his initially large following eventually fell away. The ethical doubts to which he was responding, however, did not vanish, and those doubts continued to focus on the Genesis story of the first humans. Like many of the more sophisticated Jewish and Christian thinkers, Augustine could have adopted the strategy of allegorizing the story's most awkward or conceptually embarrassing moments, but he refused to do so. For him, and through him for Orthodox Christianity, the Incarnation was bound up inseparably and literally with the original human transgression, with that history. It was critically important for this reason to determine the precise nature of Adam and Eve. I fell in Adam. In Adam was I expelled from paradise. In Adam I died. This was Augustine's great first Christian teacher, Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan. And Christ does not recall me unless he has found me in Adam. But just what did it mean to be in Adam? For Augustine, it meant, above all, to be subject to the law of the members. That is to say, to the concupiscence, as he put it, that marked human sexuality after the fall, and that transmitted to all of their descendants the culpability of the first humans and the shame that we all necessarily feel in our nakedness. Before the fall, of course, it was altogether different, and they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. Since the Gentiles who embraced Christianity were heirs to centuries of Greek and Roman art, and since they regarded the unfallen Adam and Eve as perfectly beautiful, we might have expected them to continue to produce paintings and sculptures of splendid bodies, naked and unashamed. But that's not what they produced. In paradise, the human body was like ours, but not quite. It lacked the experience of ardor and was never stretched out, stretched taut in arousal. This vision of the way it was in the beginning left the unfallen humans with physical forms that proved difficult to represent, except in what we might call dream states. For example, a beautiful ivory carving in the Bargello, dating from the time of Augustine, depicts Adam with the animals that were brought to him to name. He's not, as we might expect, standing before them like a general reviewing his troops. Instead, along with bears and lions and other beasts, he seems to be floating as if in a Maurice Sendak drawing. More common, this is a very complicated scene, but the whole question of Adam's relation to the animals, I won't go into it, but is a complicated and interesting one. More common are scenes of the creation, and especially of the creation of Eve. Adam typically lies asleep while God pulls the form of Eve from his side. Both are naked, and they do not reach to cover themselves. This is before transgression. So here at least, we're at a moment in which the body does not display any anticipatory awareness of its coming disgrace. But the figures tend to be either unconscious or only partially formed. My personal favorite is this 15th century illuminated manuscript of Bohemian origin in the Vatican Library. The text is by the 12th century French theological writer known as Peter Comestor. The last name is a Latin nickname, the Eater, not because he distinguished himself at the dinner table, but because he was an insatiable devourer of books. Many readers in the Middle Ages encountered Genesis not in the Bible, which was only infrequently read, but precisely here in Peter Comestor's popular and often illuminated paraphrase. In this version of the Vatican Library, naked Adam lies fast asleep on a kind of rock couch, while a robed God stands behind him, delicately holding in his left hand a rib on whose top sits Eve's head. He has not yet formed the rest of her body, so that she looks exactly like a stick puppet, but with his right hand, God is already giving the bare rib his blessing. The figures in such creation scenes are in effect a gesture toward the unashamed nakedness of Adam and Eve in paradise, but the bodies of the first man and woman are only notionally there. The artists who crafted such images were not ignorant of the pagan past. They could still have seen around them many remnants of classical nudes in all of their shameless beauty. They could, if they wished, have taken these nudes as models for the original humans in their perfection and in their unfallen innocence. But they chose to fashion something else, something that marked the threshold of the faith that had been crossed. The earliest Christian art already signaled its conceptual distance from pagan culture, with its insistent celebration of nudity, its gods and heroes comfortable in their well-toned, perfectly proportioned bodies. Thus, in the 3rd century of the Common Era, in the torchlit darkness of the catacomb of Saints Pietro and Marcellino in Rome, the Christian faithful looked up at a wall painting of the naked Adam and Eve standing on either side of a tree. This is one of the earliest surviving representations of Adam and Eve. Their heads lowered and their arms hunched forward, the figures are anxiously covering their genitals. Nothing could be further from Apollo or Venus. By the next century, after the conversion of the Emperor Constantine the Great, Christianity had definitively come out into the sunlight of the Roman world, but the faithful remained committed to the imagery of shame that they had created in the underground burial chambers. Around 359 of the Common Era, the powerful Roman senator Junius Bassus died and was buried in a magnificent marble sarcophagus. As befitted a recent convert, the inscription says that he's newly baptized and he went to God on the 8th day of the calends of September. His sarcophagus was elaborately carved with images from the Old and New Testaments. The naked Adam and Eve were there, but not to represent the paradisal bliss to which the senator certainly hoped to ascend. Rather, they represent, in the words of St. Paul, the body of this death, from which the deceased were delivered. By the fatal tree around which the serpent is coiled, they look down and away from one another, disgraced, ashamed, and now painfully alone, even in each other's company, they press fig leaves to their genitals. Other Christian sarcophagi from the same period repeat the same vision of abjection. Even when Adam and Eve are clearly depicted at the moment before transgression, they're already ashamed of their bodies. Reaching for the fruit with one hand, they awkwardly cover themselves with the other. The fruit may be still untasted, but the fall has happened before it actually happens. Or rather, for anyone who sees the figures, it has already happened, decisively and irreversibly. It's already history before its history. After all, the sarcophagus only exists because death has come into the world, and the person who stands and views the carvings on this receptacle is one of the fallen. There's no escape from shame, just as there's no escape from death. Though the rule of shame, so prominent in early medieval art, continued into the late Middle Ages, some artists began to explore new and surprising ways of giving more flesh to Adam and Eve, even under the signs of its disgrace. The most spectacular of these explorations, I think, is found in the town of Autun in eastern France. There, around the year 1130, on a lintel above a portal of the church of Saint-Lazare, a stonemason named Giselbertus carved a life-size image of Eve. The image is only a fragment of a larger decoration, the rest of which is lost. It only survived because it was incorporated under plaster in another building. The Eve, too, would have been lost had it not been in the masonry of the house where it was discovered when the house was being demolished in the year 1856. Giselbertus's Eve bears the traditional marks of shame. Her genitals are discreetly hidden by the sculpted trunk and leaves of a small tree, and though stretched out on the ground, she's also kneeling, as if in penance. She rests her head on her right hand in a gesture that might represent sadness or remorse. And yet here, the conventional imagery of the abject body strangely vanishes. This Eve has a powerful erotic allure. Her long hair falls loose over her shoulders, and her upper torso is turned outward toward us, showing her beautiful breasts. Her slender left arm reaches back along her body, while her hand grasps a fruit from a tree behind her, a tree in which a snake's body appears to be twisted. Her hand, as you may see, seems to be operating on its own, without her conscious will. Giselbertus then has created, or if you like, he's extrapolated from the long, complex Christian tradition, two features that confer a peculiarly intense reality effect upon his figure. The first is the possibility of forming a relationship with those who look upon her. And the second is the possibility of something hidden within her, something unknown even to her. Both features are ambiguous. The more one looks, the more this Eve at once tantalizes and resists clear resolution. She's evidently in the act of plucking the fruit, but she's not yet carried it to her mouth. And indeed, as she leans her head on her hand and looks out musingly, she seems far away from that fatal moment. Perhaps she's still innocent, and since in that case she would not yet feel shame, the leaves that shield her private parts from our gaze are only in the right place by happy accident. The allure of her body would not therefore be a sign of her awakened sexuality. Insofar as we're aroused, it is rather a sign only of our fallenness. At the same time, her kneeling and her melancholy gaze suggest inescapably that she has already fallen. She may be mourning her lost innocence, or alternatively, the serpentine twisting of her beautiful body toward us may be a deliberate provocation. Which is it? Innocent or guilty? A siren or a penitent? An emblem of everything we're meant to leave behind when we enter the church? You remember this was above a portal? Or a model of penitential deportment appropriate for entering the sacred space? Impossible to say. And the conundrum centers in proper Augustinian fashion on whatever it is that's hidden behind the vegetation blocking our view of her waist. For it is there, out of sight, that her body pivots in a way that's impossible for the actual human body to do. Giselbertus was able to use the non-naturalistic conventions of medieval art to create an Eve who is at once aware and unaware of sin, floating in a dreamlike state of innocence and kneeling in abject penitence. The sacrifice that the sculptor made was of an entirely believable human body, as the Greeks and Romans had so magnificently learned to represent it. That classical heritage was in the distant past, and Giselbertus, if he recognized it at all, would have regarded it as a small price to pay for the effect that he so brilliantly achieved. But in the centuries that followed, that price, Giselbertus's price, began to loom larger and larger until it came to seem unacceptable. Even the briefest account of the momentous shift in representation And you will understand that in everything I'm saying, there's just vast amounts of material all through these centuries. So you will have your own images in mind. Even the briefest account of the momentous shift would certainly include the fresco painted by Masaccio around 1425 for the Church of the Carmelite Nuns in Florence that shows the grief-stricken Adam and Eve at the moment of their expulsion through the gates of paradise. When I first saw these figures in the 1960s, they were modestly, if scantily, dressed in fig leaves. Modesty aside, the covering made sense, since, as we read in Genesis, Adam and Eve sewed fig leaves together in the wake of the fall in response to their newfound experience of shame. And God, for his part, dressed them in skins before driving them out of paradise. So from a strictly textual point of view, the fig-leaved figures in the fresco were, if anything, a bit underdressed. But a thorough cleaning of the fresco in the 1980s removed the fig leaves. They turned out to have been a later addition and disclosed that Masaccio's Adam and Eve were entirely naked. Her head tilted back, her eyes closed, and her mouth open in a soundless wail. Eve attempts to cover her genitals with one hand, her breasts with the other. Her sense of shame bears no relation to the scene in which she finds herself. That is, it is not a social emotion, not a preservation of dignity, which drives her to try to conceal her sex. It's a primordial sense of what she must do in the face of an unendurable exposure. Adam's response is different. His head bent down, he covers his face with his hands in a paroxysm of misery. Unlike Eve, his genitals are startlingly visible. Masaccio's unforgettable figures depend on an illusion of actuality heightened by the shadows that they cast. Just try this for fun. Oops, that won't do. I was going to see if I could, it doesn't really matter, but this is, yes, I mean, it's all right. You get the shadows that they cast from a light source that we don't see. And by the effect of movement that they achieve through the famous Renaissance effect of contrapposto. Adam's right foot still touches the threshold of paradise, but not for long. They are in the world now, and unlike the angel, who possesses wings, a beautiful garment, a sword, and a kind of magic carpet, the humans are utterly unprepared. The prime source of their misery, no doubt, is the shame and guilt they feel as a result of their transgression, but the glimpse of the barren soil on which their feet now tread might suggest another, more material source as well. You can't see it in this slide, but if you look closely, there are little stones in their path. They're entering a very harsh environment, and they have nothing whatsoever to shield or protect them. Adam's penis, strikingly central in the fresco's composition, is, from this perspective, less a sign of virility than of his being what Shakespeare calls unaccommodated man. The other painting that marks what the Renaissance did with the Augustinian insistence on the literal is found on the outer panels of the Flemish master Jan van Eyck's celebrated Ghent altarpiece from 1432. The figures are not dramatic in a way that Masaccio's are, but the panels invite an almost compulsive, amazed inspection of human nakedness. Adam's expression is sober. His hands are reddened, probably from labor. Eve holds an odd-looking fruit in one hand, probably some kind of citrus that's not quite clear. Her belly, the womb from which we all descended, is strikingly prominent. Everything in the minutest detail seems to be open to view. I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but Adam's clipped toenails and his random hairs, can't quite see them here, but the random hairs are particularly disturbing. No artist, including Michelangelo, who painted his famous fresco of the creation of Adam on the Sistine ceiling some 80 years later, no artist has ever matched, let alone exceeded, the astonishing realism of Van Eyck's Adam and Eve. They were, at the beginning, exactly what we are now, creatures of flesh and blood who know that they cannot leave their bodies except in death. That Van Eyck was fully aware of what he had done is implicit in his entire conception of the work. But a small, invisible detail provides a special insight into this conception. An infrared reflectogram, a modern technique for looking beneath the layers of paint in order to see the artist's original intentions and the alterations made as the work developed, revealed a startling change in the orientation of Adam's right foot. Van Eyck had at first depicted Adam as standing fully within his niche, with both of his feet parallel to the picture frame, but at a certain point, presumably as the figure increasingly acquired the effect of bodily reality, he changed his mind. He turned the foot outward so that the toes seemed to be projecting out of the niche and toward the viewer. It is as if Adam had come alive and was stepping into our world. But in the 15th century, when this altarpiece was painted, Adam could only have this magical effect on viewers who happened to be in Ghent, went to St. Bavo's Cathedral, and saw the altarpiece in its open state. The same need to be present in a particular place was true, of course, of Masaccios Adam and Eve in the Carmine in Florence, or Michelangelo's Adam on the Sistine ceiling, or the hundreds of other Renaissance paintings that participated in the project of conferring bodies on the first humans. All of these works were site-specific. In some cases, their reputation may have spread, sketches may have been produced and circulated, but their actual effects could only be experienced by those who ventured in person to the place to which they were permanently attached. I shouldn't say permanently in the case, of course, of this famous one, because the Nazis stole it for a while, various other attempts to take it out of Ghent. All of this changed in 1504. That was the year in which Albrecht Dürer produced his famous engraving of the Fall of Man. Since copperplate technology meant that it could be handsomely reproduced again and again, it was successfully marketed and circulated. As a result, a large number of people across Europe saw the same compelling image and felt that they now knew what the first humans in the Garden of Eden had looked like. With Dürer, the unfallen Adam and Eve got their modern bodies, the bodies by which they became and still remain instantly identifiable. Of course, have changed in the endless reproductions of them, but it's to Dürer that we owe, even though it looks very different, that peculiar effect that all of us have, which is that you see a sketch, every 10th cartoon in the New Yorker is a little back of a naked person or a tree, and you know immediately what it is. You don't know the joke that's coming, but we know from the briefest sketch what this is. Since copperplate technology meant, as I say, that it could be shared, everyone could see, or in any case, a very large number of people got to see this image almost immediately. Dürer's engraving represents Adam and Eve facing toward us on either side of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The fatal tree is not strikingly different in form from any other tree around them, but it's bearing fruit, as you can see, that hangs on the branches just above Eve's head. Eve holds one of the fruits in her left hand. In plucking it, she's taken, I say in her left hand, but I'm sorry, it's her right hand. Eve holds one of the fruits. In plucking it, she's taken some of the tree along with the fruit, for a twig extends from its stem across half of her body, as you can see. There's no trace of shame in her posture, but the leaves and the twig just happen to cover her genitals. In her other hand, she's also holding a fruit in her fingertips. She's presumably receiving it. Oh, I was right, actually. It is her left hand. I was confused because I suddenly looked up and right. So her left hand holding this way is holding the fruit, and it's her right hand that is apparently receiving a fruit from the serpent. Sorry about that. She's presumably receiving it, but her gesture is delicate and ambiguous enough to suggest that she could be feeding the animal instead of being fed by it. She's turned her head, her long hair flowing out behind her, and she's looking intently at the serpent and at the fruit. Adam has also turned his head, but he's directing his gaze at Eve. Reaching back with his right hand, he holds onto the branch of a tree, and that's presumably the tree of life. A smaller branch from lower in the trunk of that tree just happens to cover his genitals. His left arm reaches out toward Eve, and his hand is open, as if ready to receive the fruit that she's taking, evidently, from the serpent's mouth. The first humans are still perfectly innocent and unashamed, but this is the last moment. So this is a fantastic idea of representing the moment before history, in effect, the last possible moment before history. Human nature is about to change forever, and in the same instant, all of nature will change. Adam, as you can see, nearly steps on the tail of a small mouse, while a cat dozes by his other foot. We know that as soon as the fatal fruit is eaten, the cat will pounce, and the poor mouse, too, will be eaten. But like the suspended leap of the mountain goat that you might see just up there, in the far distance, it's all in the realm of the not quite yet. The realm of the not quite yet, registered in the flesh, is Dürer's most remarkable contribution to the life of Adam and Eve. The depiction of this final moment, of this literally prehistoric moment of innocence, captured as if by a camera with a very fast shutter speed, was the consequence of a decades-long search. As Joseph Kerner has shown in his great book, The Moment of Self-Portraiture in German Renaissance Art, it drew upon everything in the artist's whole career and life. Dürer was a descendant of Adam, of that he was sure, and this descent meant that his own naked body had, at least to a small extent, to resemble Adam's. Of course, in paradise, Adam's body was perfect, and all bodies since that time, including his own, had fallen away from the original perfection. Nevertheless, to grasp Adam's body so far back in the past, so inaccessible, Dürer had not only to study classical statuary and to sketch nude models, but also to reflect powerfully on his own nakedness. This astonishing nude self-portrait that bears witness to this attention was unprecedented, but as a remark by Savonarola suggests, the underlying idea was proverbial. Savonarola said, "Every painter paints, as the saying goes, actually himself." The fall of man, this engraving, secured Dürer's fame, as he seems to have been confident that it would. Signed so conspicuously, Albert Dürer, Noricus faciebat, 1504, the engraving became the definitive image of Adam and Eve, or as close to definitive as any single representation of figures so widely and frequently depicted could possibly be. Of course, along with almost everyone else who picked up a pen, Dürer continued to paint and draw images of Adam and Eve. I could show you many more, but virtually all subsequent images have an odd way of seeming to allude deliberately or inadvertently, in homage or in opposition to the 1504 pair. We do not know what images of Adam and Eve John Milton had seen before he went completely blind in 1652 at the age of 44. But when Milton first describes the pair as glimpsed by Satan in Book 4 of Paradise Lost, it's easy to detect the influence of Dürer's engraving. Two of far nobler shape, erect and tall, godlike erect, with native honor clad, in naked majesty, seemed lords of all. His fair, large front, forehead, and eye sublime declared absolute rule, and hyacinthine locks round from his parted forelock manly hung, clustering, but not beneath his shoulders broad. She, as a veil down to the slender waist, her unadorned golden tresses wore, disheveled, but in wanton ringlets waved, as the vine curls her tendrils. There's no question here, I think, of a direct recollection. It's rather that in Paradise Lost, Adam and Eve have, through Dürer and those who followed in his wake, acquired realized prelapsarian bodies. Milton, as Brian Cummings has observed in a very fine recent study, Milton is the great poet of embodiment. More than anyone else in his age, he understood and seized upon what had happened. Renaissance art had done what Augustine only dreamed of doing. It had fleshed out the shadowy figures of Adam and Eve, capturing the way things were at the moment of the not quite yet. Milton did not depict the first humans through a kind of mystical haze or delicately hidden from view by strategically placed fig leaves. They were not theoretical figures. He wanted to see them and to have his readers see them naked and in all the vigor of robust youth. There was nothing ethereal about them. When hungry, they sat down on a soft bank by a stream and ate the fruit that grew abundantly around them. The savory pulp they chew, as the poem pictures the scene, and in the rind, still as they thirsted, scoop the brimming stream. What Milton grasped was that this embodied reality would have to entail a comparably embodied relationship, a relationship that he felt uniquely called to decipher and to represent. The narrative in Genesis was for him the key to unlocking the meaning of virtually everything: anthropology, psychology, ethics, politics, history, faith. And like Augustine and Dürer, he did not merely lay claim to the story of Adam and Eve, the story laid claim to him. It had for years inhabited him like an incubus, haunting virtually every facet of his experience, from his expectation of marital bliss to his plea for divorce, from his educational schemes to his understanding of Jesus, from his political radicalism to his conception of why the revolution had failed. It fed upon the secrets of his life history: his passionate friendship with Charles Diodati, the fantasies he cherished during the many years he proudly preserved his virginity. He was incredibly proud of being a 32-year-old virgin. And above all, the feelings aroused in him around the time of his first marriage and disastrous honeymoon. It was by courageously tapping into these dark recesses that Milton discovered what his genius needed to bring forth what had so long been growing within him. The result was that his Adam and Eve took on a more intense life, the life both of fully realized individuals and of a married couple, than they had ever possessed in the thousands of years since they were first conceived. In his conversation with the angel Raphael, Milton's Adam recalls the moment when God brought all of the animals before him, 2 by 2. Adam duly gave the animals names. The poem discreetly avoids indicating how long the parade must have taken. But he found himself unaccountably missing something, though he was not sure exactly what it was. He turned to the divine figure standing next to him and asked, "In solitude, what happiness?" God smiled and asked in return what he meant by solitude. Had the human not just been introduced to every species in the entire world? Some of these species, God added, are capable of reason, and Adam could find pastime with them. Adam persisted. All of the animals, even the best of them, were far below him. Among unequals, he asked God, among unequals, what society can sort, what harmony or true delight? The divine response was a strange one. "What do you think of me?" God asked Adam. "I'm alone for all eternity, and I'm without equal. All creatures I converse with are infinitely, literally infinitely below me, not to mention the fact that they've all been made by me. Seem I to thee sufficiently possessed of happiness or not?" This is an uncomfortable question to be posed by anyone, let alone by God. And it's not surprising that the human's answer was diplomatic to the point of incomprehensibility. But in the midst of his extravagant compliments and evasions, Adam did manage to observe that while he would not venture to speak for God, he could attest to his own desire to have a conversation with another human, and not with one of the lower animals. Moreover, he added that God, being perfect, has no need to propagate, but that he, the human, knew that he was somehow deficient. Why the first man had this feeling of inadequacy, which turned out to have the most serious consequences, is not entirely clear. Genesis did not provide any guidance, so that Milton had to reach back to his own experience, to whatever it was that drove him in that fateful July of 1642 to end his solitary virginal existence and to take a wife. Adam must have been painfully aware, Milton thought, of what he called, marvelously, his single imperfection, that is, the imperfection of being single. It is as if this sense of his own deficiency was built into his nature as a man. And of course, it was intensified not only when he saw the animal pairs, but when he conversed with his Creator. You are infinite, Adam told God, but as a finite creature, I want and I need to multiply my image. At this point in the conversation, God said something else that Adam must have found disquieting. He told Adam that he'd only been testing him to see if he would be willing to settle for any of the beasts brought before him. This is perhaps an oblique recollection of the Midrashic idea, of which Milton was certainly aware, Milton had learned Hebrew, that Adam actually tried sex with all of the animals before the creation of the woman. By holding out for a human interlocutor, Adam had passed the test. God declared, adding that he already knew before Adam spoke that it was not good for a human to be alone. There is, as I don't have time to get into now, a very complex theological history behind this Miltonic intervention, because from very, very early on, commentators asked how it was possible that God says it's not good for man to be alone, as he says in Genesis chapter 2. Didn't he realize that in Genesis chapter 1? Could he have been imperfect? Could God have been imperfect? Could God be making it up as he goes along, as it were? It was a very difficult idea. Hence, I was just testing you moment in Milton. Oh, that's part of it anyway. It was just as well that the test was over at this point. Adam tells Raphael, for the strain of conversing with God was so great that Adam, dazed and spent, as he put it, was ready to collapse. Collapse he did, but then, as if in a trance, he was able to see himself laying on the ground and to watch. I can't resist saying as a footnote that there is a very interesting Eastern tradition in the Cappadocian Fathers that the reason for the fall was that Adam simply became exhausted by contemplating God, couldn't stand another moment of it. It was simply too wearying. But that's a whole other tradition. Collapse he did, as I say, but then as if in a trance, he was able to see himself lying on the ground and to watch while God stooped down, opened his left side, and removed a rib with lifeblood streaming fresh. The rabbis similarly considered the possibility that Adam could actually have witnessed the fashioning of the woman from his own bone, but they imagined that if he did so, he would have been so disgusted by what he saw that God would have had to destroy the creature and start again. Milton, who may have had this Midrashic comment in mind, insisted that for Adam, the sight was only thrilling, not disgusting. Her looks, Adam recalls, infused sweetness into my heart, unfelt before. Others before Milton had at least implied the arousal of such feelings in Adam. The Genesis verses suggest them in the words that burst forth from the first man at the sight of the first woman. It's a poem in the Hebrew that repeats again and again the feminine pronoun zot. This one, zot, zot. In Hieronymus Bosch's famously strange painting, known as the Garden of Earthly Delights, Adam stares up at the newly created nubile Eve with what might be at least a look of rapt wonder. But the Adam of Paradise Lost, the man who emerged from the poet's nightly dreams, articulates his erotic delight with unprecedented intensity and eloquence. Milton could draw upon the great flowering of love poetry in the English Renaissance. Whoever loved that loved not at first sight, asked Christopher Marlowe. And he seems to be drawing as well upon moments of personal experience. It was, after all, his own momentous intuition of love's sweetness, unfelt before, that drove him to propose marriage to Mary Powell after doing little more than glimpsing her. Milton had staked his life's happiness on that glimpse and the emotions that it awakened in him. And if he knew all too well at this point in his life the pain that in reality lay ahead, he was nonetheless able, in bringing Adam to life, to access what it was that he had so intensely felt. Those feelings, the poem makes clear, braided together what Milton in the Divorce Tracts called the delectableness of conversation with the joys of the marriage bed. Milton knew perfectly well that Catholic intellectuals had long speculated that in paradise, sexual intercourse was designed only to produce offspring, and thus to be undertaken with a kind of cool detachment. He had read Augustine's account that the act, performed without arousal, would have been entirely calm, unremarkable, and public. Paradise Lost provides a kind of eyewitness, or rather body witness testimony that this whole theological tradition was a lie. Whatever hypocrites austerely talk of purity and place and innocence, Milton insists, Adam and Eve in paradise had spectacularly good sex, and they had it in private. Their bower was enclosed, and it was theirs alone. No other creature, Milton writes, beast, bird, insect, or worm dared enter. It was a space chosen by the sovereign planter and given to the humans for the passionate, exclusive possession of each other's body, the only form of private property, the poem remarks, in a world where everything else was held in common. Eve decked the nuptial bed with flowers and sweet-smelling herbs, and there they experienced what Adam calls the sum of earthly bliss. The dilemma is that the union of this intense bodily pleasure with the joy of genuine conversation was incompatible with any stable hierarchical order that Milton was able to imagine, either for Adam and Eve, or perhaps for himself. Milton thought he knew what such an order would have to feel and sound like. The first humans were both magnificent specimens, but they were by no means equal. For contemplation, he, and valor formed. For softness, she, and sweet, attractive grace, he wrote, then adding a line that has become notorious for its complacent, self-congratulatory sexism. He for God only, she for God in him. The surprise is not that Milton thought of the first pair in such terms. Almost every man in his world, and probably most of the women as well, would have subscribed to the same picture, but rather that he committed himself to probing their relationship, as it were, from the inside. How to account for a marriage's cycles of adoration and execration, excitement and revulsion, comfort and misery? How to explain the peculiarly intense commitment human beings make to one another, and to depict the way this commitment plays out over time? Here, Milton's beloved Shakespeare could offer very little help, and still less would come from the Greek and Latin classics that he knew so well. Milton recognized a fundamental and unresolvable problem. The problem was not, as he conceived it, the unwillingness of the woman to submit. His is not a story about Lilith. Rather, there was, he thought, something disruptive to marriage in the very experience of love, for men at least as much as for women. Adam tries to explain the problem to Raphael. I understand, he tells the angel, that she is the inferior one. I know that though we've both been made in the image of God, I resemble God more exactly than she does. I grasp that I was created to be and meant to remain on top. But when I approach her loveliness, he confesses, this account no longer seems true. So absolute she seems, and in herself complete, that if anything, it's she who seems the superior human being. The angel's response, he contracts his brow and tells Adam to have more self-esteem, is not helpful. Raphael warns Adam not to overvalue mere sexual pleasure, a pleasure, he says scornfully, that is vouchsafed to cattle and every other beast. Adam replies with dignity that it's not only what happens in bed, though he regards that with greater reverence than Raphael's remark suggests, that accounts for the feelings he's tried to describe. Rather, he says, it is those graceful acts, those thousand decencies, those words and actions that bespeak a union of mind that so delight him in Eve. His love, the intimate physical and spiritual communion with his wife, cancels out the sense of superiority to which he knows that as a male he's meant to cling. Instead, he feels an overwhelming bond. In us both, he says, one soul. There is in Adam's words a polite but firm suggestion that the angel and his heavenly cohort have a very imperfect grasp of human experience. Indeed, Milton's first human famously allows himself to wonder, given the angel's obtuseness, just what angelic sexual experience is like. Here, as in his earlier conversation with God, Adam manifests a kind of stubborn human independence that would be completely shocking if one didn't remember the Milton who was expelled from Cambridge University by his enraged tutor, or who refused the easy career path in the church that had been laid out before him, or who rose up against the king and his bishops, or who was determined to work out his own personal theology. The Adam who took living form in Milton's imagination was precisely not someone who would simply accept the doctrine that had been handed down from on high. But in this case, the superiority of the male over the female, Milton himself did not doubt that the conventional doctrine was true. The trouble was that this truth could not be reconciled with what it actually felt like in body and soul to love someone. We have no idea what happened in those weeks in the summer of 1640, more than a quarter of a century earlier, when Milton came back to London with his young bride, when they briefly lived together, and when she left him. It is very unlikely that the experience, whatever it was, served as the direct model for the Adam and Eve who emerged in the poet's imagination. But that there was a painful tension between what Milton believed were the appropriate roles for him and for Mary to play, and what they actually experienced, that much is clear. In the bitterness of the divorce tracts, the fault is laid entirely upon the miserably unresponsive wife. To have sexual intercourse with such a dull life partner, he writes, is to grind in the mill of an undelighted and servile copulation. In Paradise Lost, however, the tension is transmuted into something far more rich and strange. The hierarchy, he for God only, she for God in him, begins to break under the weight of the husband's overwhelming recognition of his wife's beauty, kindness, and above all, autonomy. So absolute she seems, and in herself complete. Eve's autonomy comes to the test on the morning after the angel's visitation, when the pair awakens to begin the day's tasks in the garden. The tasks are meant to be pleasant, the poem insists, but the work is real, not merely symbolic. And Eve echoes Adam's observation that it's getting out of hand. What they accomplish in the day, lop overgrown or prune or prop or bind, is undone by the night's growth. Until more hands aid us, she says, they're only falling further behind. She proposes an experiment, a new idea that she's come up with to address the problem that they have both recognized. Let us divide our labors, she suggests, so that they lose less time in idle conversation. She's come up with a fantastic idea of the division of labor. Adam initially gives a mild answer, as Milton puts it, prefacing it with the elaborate courtly address Milton imagines that the first humans typically used. Soul, Eve, associate soul, to me, beyond compare of all, above all living creatures dear, and so forth. Her proposal for the division of labor, he tells her, is praiseworthy, for nothing lovelier can be found in woman than to study household good. But it's misguided, for this, after all, is paradise, and work is not meant to be drudgery. For a brief moment, he shifts ground. If perhaps what Eve is really saying is that she's been finding their conversation tiresome, he would be willing to let her go off briefly by herself. For solitude sometime is best society, he says. And then, not waiting for an answer and not leaving well enough alone, he makes the mistake of telling Eve that with Satan possibly lurking about, she should not in any case leave, quote, the faithful side that gave thee being, end quote. Now he's trying very hard to sound like the man that Raphael wanted him to be. The wife where danger or dishonor lurks, safest and seemliest by her husband stays, who guards her, or with her the worst endures. Replying with sweet, austere composure, Eve, too, begins with a courtly address, offspring of heaven and earth, and all earth's Lord. But she quickly turns to an expression of hurt feelings. That you should doubt my firmness, she tells Adam, I expected not to hear. Poor domestic Adam, Milton calls him, tries to appease her, carefully eschewing now the suggestion that the wife is always safest by her husband's side. He renews his urging that they face together any threat from Satan, but the damage is not so easily undone. Eve still speaks with accent sweet, but this time she drops the polite formula altogether. If this be our condition, she begins, how are we happy? We must have been created with sufficient moral strength. Her word is integrity, so as to enable us to resist temptation, whether in company or alone. Let us not imagine, she says, that the Creator made us so imperfect as to require us constantly to cling to one another for defense. Frail is our unhappiness, if this be so. And we're no Eden, thus exposed. We know, of course, that all of this is heading for disaster. But it's difficult to refute Eve's argument, since we also know that Satan's threat is not a temporary one. Were they never going to part, even for a few hours? In that case, she might as well, as she quips, have remained his rib. And after all, her confidence in her own integrity mirrors Adam's admiring sense that she seems in herself complete. Unhappy and exasperated, Adam bursts out, finally, "Oh, woman!" As if called upon to defend the whole order of things, he declares that there's nothing imperfect or deficient in anything God created. His defensiveness seems a bit strange, since this is precisely Eve's point, until we recall that he had earlier expressed to God his own feeling that by himself he was both imperfect and deficient. But now, in acknowledging that Eve cannot in principle lack the firmness she would need to resist temptation, Adam has backed himself into a corner. God left free the will, he says, and in saying so, he has to permit Eve to leave his side. Go, he says, for thy stay not free absents thee more. Then, marvelously, with thy permission then, she replies, withdrawing her hand from his and going off on her own. Anyone who has had an argument with a partner, which is to say anyone who's ever lived with someone for more than a few days, will recognize how brilliantly Milton captures the peculiar sense of love, anger, hurt feelings, attempts at appeasement, insincere compliments, passive aggression, frustration, submission, independence, and longing. And the genius of this invention is all the more remarkable, given the fact that Milton needs to persuade the reader that this squabbling husband and wife are in Eden and still unfallen. This is what a domestic quarrel in paradise sounds like. It was not enough for Milton to develop an elaborate backstory, the war in heaven, and Satan's malicious enmity toward the humans that God had created. That backstory helped to make sense of the mysterious role in Genesis of the serpent, or at least to create a narrative that leads up to the temptation. But the first humans had ceased to be mere ciphers. Milton could not stand the notion that they were simply tricked by Satan into disobeying, the victims of a celestial plot. Adam and Eve must be intelligent, well-informed, forewarned. They must be free, and they must be innocent. But if they're both free and innocent, then there must be something disturbing in innocence and threatening in freedom. What is disturbing in innocence, to this we owe an extremely elaborate discourse by Kierkegaard, as you no doubt know, what is disturbing in innocence is the impossibility of understanding evil, no matter how many warnings you receive, no matter how much you try to imagine it or experience it in dreams. What is threatening in freedom, and to this we owe a very long, difficult discourse by Kant, is glimpsed in the pain of Adam's acknowledgement as he lets Eve go. Thy stay not free absents thee more. There are some things that you cannot compel, however desperately you may wish to do so, true intimacy being foremost among them. And Eve's loving, perhaps lightly ironic attempt to assume the mantle of submission, with thy permission then, does not hide her persistent refusal or inability to give up her freedom. She might be persuaded, but she cannot and will not be compelled. It's this ineradicable freedom that threatens and in the end brings down innocence. But Milton clearly thought that innocence without freedom was worthless, a state of perpetual childishness or bondage. Everything in his life, in his politics, his religious faith, his educational theory, his views of marriage, his views of divorce, focused on consent, freely given or freely withheld. This sphere of personal freedom, the core of Milton's sense of any life worth living and any relationship worth having, is why, notwithstanding Adam's anxiety and frustration, it makes perfect sense for Eve to go off by herself for a few hours, and why it's appropriate for her to be alone when she faces the fateful temptation. Freedom belongs to each individual as an individual. In the wake of their fateful choices, God chooses to inflict upon them not an immediate death, but what Adam calls a slow-paced evil, a long day's dying to augment our pain. He decrees their expulsion from paradise in order to make sure that the humans do not have the opportunity to reach out to the tree of life and eat and live forever. Though Milton was simply quoting directly from Genesis at this point, he seems to have been uneasy with this archaic glimpse of divine anxiety, lest they reach out and eat and live forever. Milton has his God add a qualifier. Eat and live forever, dream at least to live forever. But the qualifier seems to undermine the whole motive for the expulsion. Milton uncharacteristically failed to wrestle the theological problem to its knees. He focused instead on the intense human anxiety caused by the divine decree. Adam stands stunned with sorrow. He cannot speak. Eve weeps at the prospect of saying farewell forever to the flowers she's planted and the nuptial bower she's adorned. The archangel Michael, sent by God to enforce the decree, simply tells the woman that she should not be, quote, overfond, end quote, of what was not hers in the first place. The disconnect between this angelic perspective and the perspective of the human beings evicted from their home by an implacable landlord shapes the whole conclusion of Milton's poem. For by the close of Paradise Lost, and here I'm coming to my end, Adam and Eve have become so intensely embedded in Milton's imagination that they begin to crack open the whole theological apparatus that brought them into being. Michael, Raphael, Satan, even God and his Son all shrink in significance. For Milton, to be sure, the theological scheme was still in place. He professed to believe both in the justice of the horrible punishments that would be visited on all humankind as a result of man's first disobedience, and in the salvation that would be brought to the faithful by Jesus Christ. But for the first man and woman to assume the imaginative weight of full human lives, lives lived in history, meant not only that they must die, but also, as Augustine had not anticipated, that the mythic narrative that gave them birth would also have to die. When Milton undertook to justify God's ways to man, the story of Adam and Eve was already under great pressure. In 1498, on his third voyage, Columbus believed that the great streams of fresh water he observed in Trinidad's Gulf of Paria meant that he was approaching the earthly paradise. But it proved to be South America that he was approaching. And the untold numbers of inhabitants, many of them naked and perfectly unashamed, that the Europeans encountered in lands whose existence they had not suspected, were difficult to reconcile with biblical geography, chronology, or anthropology. In 1655, the French Protestant Isaac Laperrière published in Amsterdam a book in Latin called the Prae Adamitai, followed a year later in Latin by an English translation, Men Before Adam. The book proposed that Adam was not the father of humankind. He was only the father of the Jews, whom God had mysteriously chosen to receive the law and to be, through Jesus Christ, the agents of redemption. This particular genealogy, Laperrière wrote, is the reason that the time frame of Genesis seems so out of sync with, quote, all profane records, whether ancient or new, to wit, those of the Chaldeans, Egyptians, Scythians, and Chinesians, not to mention those of Mexico, not long ago discovered by Columbus, end quote. The problems disappear if you recognize that the world was already full of people before the creation of Adam. In February 1656, 30 armed men stormed into Laperrière's room in Brussels and hauled him off to Rome, charged with being an hérétique détestable. Offered the choice of the stake or recantation, he took the sensible course. He had been led astray, he wrote, by his Calvinist upbringing, which had erroneously led him to believe that he had the right to interpret Scripture according to reason and his own conscience. That was the path that led him to the pre-Adamite theory, but now he understood he had to follow neither the dictates of reason nor the promptings of conscience, but only the authority of the Pope. Pope Alexander VII, who had personally interested himself in the case, was said to have laughed delightedly. Laperrière was effectively silenced, but it was not so simple. For his detestable heresies were not the consequence of doubt. They were the result of trying to take the story of Adam and Eve literally. That is, the result of the same forces that led Renaissance painters to give them bodily reality and that led Milton to confer upon them a human relationship. Their collective success, the triumphant fulfillment of the old Augustinian dream, had an unintended and devastating consequence. What has truly come alive will begin to die. Of course, the figures of Adam and Eve within the story were always understood to be mortal as the consequence of their transgression, but their coming into full life through the astonishing energeia of Renaissance art and literature made the story in which they were embedded mortal. The mortality of a narrative, one that has, as an article of faith, been taken as true for a very long time, is not the same as a human's. The aging process is not comparable. There are no telltale signs of impending collapse. No heirs crowd in by the bedside weeping or hoping for a legacy. Above all, there's no moment in which a myth decisively stops breathing and a licensed physician hurries into the room to certify that indeed it's all come to an end. What happens instead is simply that a significant number of people, though by no means all of them, cease to believe that the story depicts reality, or that its characters, whether gods, demons, or humans, actually exist or have ever existed. Others may continue fervently to believe after the decline has begun, but the ground has begun to shift, and the process is irreversible. Even those who think that the story is untrue may hold on to it for some time, whether because it's awkward or dangerous not to do so, or because the alternative is not clear, or because it still seems to convey something important about life. But its key elements have begun to shimmer like a mirage. They have ceased to be solid truths in the real world and have begun to drift toward make-believe. The narrative becomes a just-so story, a fanciful attempt to account for the way things are, a fiction. Laperrière was only a foretaste. What lay ahead was the surgical irony of Pierre Bayle's historical and critical dictionary, the probing questions of Leibniz, of Kant and Kierkegaard, the bitter mockery of Voltaire and Mark Twain, and perhaps just as devastating, the altogether secularized, naturalized, and far from Edenic marriages depicted in the great realist novels of the 19th century. It was Milton who had pioneered the convincing representation of such fictional marriages, but the physical and metaphysical ground on which his couple once walked had begun to crumble into dust. In 1871, the year that George Eliot published Middlemarch, Charles Darwin published The Descent of Man. Darwin does not even mention Adam and Eve. Milton had hardly willed that future. Yet what most arrested his attention at his poem's end was not the grand vision of fall and redemption, but rather the pair's quiet intimacy. Though Adam has run ahead in order to have time alone with her, he cannot reply to Eve's beautiful, loving words. For now, too nigh the archangel stood, after she says these words. The things that a man and a woman say to each other at such a moment are not public utterances intended for an official audience. The cherubim, advancing with their flaming swords, take their stations and begin to change the temperate climate of paradise into something that resembles the heat of Libya. Michael seizes Adam and Eve in either hand, hurries them down through the garden, to the gate rather, onto the plain below, and then disappears. What follows are among the most beautiful lines that Milton ever wrote. Some natural tears they dropped, but wiped them soon. The world was all before them, where to choose their place of rest, and Providence their guide. They, hand in hand, with wandering steps and slow, through Eden took their solitary way. The lines continue to express faith in divine providence, but still more in the freedom that Milton believed that the first couple possessed, the freedom that still belongs to all humans. At its close, Paradise Lost liberates Adam and Eve from the story that gave them birth and watches them advance together, hand in hand, toward an uncertain future. More than 1,000 years after Augustine, Adam and Eve had finally become real. Thank you very much. I would be delighted, honored to take questions, comments, criticisms, and so forth and so on. Whatever you have it in you to say. Yes, please.
That was great, thank you. I wonder if you see the legacy of Adam and Eve living on at all in the contemporary world, in stories about our genetic origins, about contemporary ways, struggles to understand evolution, etc.
Could you hear the question, by the way? No, the question was, do I see the story of Adam and Eve living on in the present, for example, in attempts to understand our evolutionary heritage? And I would say several things. It's a long, the full answer would have to be a very long one, and I've thought quite a bit about it. I mean, the first thing to say is that 40% of Americans, according to the Pew Trust, claim to believe in the literal truth of the story of the existence of Adam and Eve. So this is by no means, I speak to you as if we all get it, as it were, but this is not the case. And I would say that I was able to write the book that I've just written because I came to realize that this astonishing figure of 40% is not, I think, or at least not principally, or not only the reflection of mind-boggling ignorance, but it is actually because the story is fantastically good to think with, and it has been good to think with for a very long time, and that our story, the story we believe to be the true story, that I believe to be the true story, is actually very hard to think with. Now that's partly because it's new. It's only actually from the middle of the 19th century, so we'd be talking about its, how should we say, pre-Augustinian moment. It hasn't had its, in that sense, its Augustine, let alone its Milton. So it's actually extremely difficult to inhabit the story, to understand, in fact, and I don't believe there is an adequate explanation at the moment of how we got from Lucy, the Australopithecus, to the figures who actually have moral responsibility. We have Nietzsche's argument, which is that you have to torture people for thousands of years to get them to keep promises, and maybe that's part of the answer, but this is a very strange piece of a very complicated puzzle that we haven't adequately encountered. So my first thought is that the story is, in fact, the reason the story keeps turning up in the New Yorker, as it were, I mean, or anywhere, or with so many people believing, is it's good to think with. And it's good to think with also about the paradox of human responsibility, which we are constantly grappling with, because we do, after all, punish people. Our society is based on punishing people for things that we know they're not completely responsible for, because they've received something, an inheritance that they can barely resist. So that the Augustinian breakthrough, as it were, Augustine is an extremely nasty piece of work in many ways, but the great challenge for Augustine was how to answer Pelagius, who was a kind of Upper East Side or 02138 Cambridge figure, who believed that humans are basically fundamentally salvageable. There's something they have very bad examples, they make horrible mistakes, but they're fundamentally decent. Augustine says there's something fundamentally wrong with the species. But it didn't keep Augustine from wanting to punish humans for their act. And that's the story around which this fiendish, Kafka-like inheritance of the books, the chapters 2 and 3 of Genesis is formed. So there are many other ways of answering the question, but I do think, for me, the story is still immensely alive, but is immensely alive as an example of what literature has to offer in its extremely boiled down sort of state, literature 1.0, which is that it, in astonishingly few verses, in a short compass, manages to catch something profoundly problematical about sex, labor, relationships, punishment, and so forth and so on, crammed into this little fiction, this little narrative fiction. Yeah.
Hello, sir. My name is Rebecca Curtis. I'm teaching a undergraduate class to 18 and 19-year-olds at Hunter CUNY. And we are currently reading Othello, and I've been having them read a portion of your book, Renaissance Self-Fashioning, Power and Improvisation. So I guess my question depends on the relationship of Desdemona and Othello, and in reading to these young students about Christian doctrine and sexuality, how prelapsarian sex took place, and how was it that Adam was able to get an erection without desire. They found very interesting, I want you to know. But in the end of that piece, in that essay, you say more than Iago's empathy. Of course, we love to blame Iago on what happened to Othello. It's really Desdemona's desire that brought down the fall. And so I was thinking, as you were speaking, how perhaps maybe you've been thinking about this Adam and Eve story for a very long time, and how you saw, or perhaps unconsciously, or even just the consciousness of the time, saw Desdemona and Othello as Adam and Eve, as Adam and Eve figures.
Thank you. Well, you remind me, and in fact I had forgotten, truthfully, that I have been thinking about this for a crazily long time. That's a very old essay, and it does indeed, as you suggest, rehearse not quite what I was describing tonight, but some of the same issues. It is the case that and it probably is an inheritance, an Augustinian inheritance. It is the case that for Milton as well, even in the paradisal state, Adam is more anxious than Eve. This is a recurrent perception. It may actually be how should we say, a trap for women to think so. Maybe part of a male trick in the period, but it's not by any means unique to Shakespeare. Because it's also in Milton that there's something anxious about the male in Milton's vision and in Shakespeare's vision, and that the anxiety, in the case of Othello, very explicitly and specifically focuses on sexuality, as it does in many ways in Paradise Lost as well. In the case of Othello, what I argued a long time ago, as I say, is that it's Desdemona. It's things that look very simple and innocent in Desdemona. When Othello says, when they're united again in Cyprus, and he says he's having a kind of, how should we say, an orgasm, let's put it that way, and he says, I can't stand another moment of this. I mean, I'm near. This is a near-death experience. I can't go any further than this. Desdemona says something to the effect of, oh, it's only going to get better and better, more and more of this. And I think that is terrifying to Othello. And I think that some representation of a similar kind turns up repeatedly in the male literature doesn't turn up, I think, in the female literature of the period. So as I say, I think this is a kind of self-reflection on the part of men, but it's a recurrent self-reflection, and I think a fairly deep one. And one of its roots has to do with thinking about an inheritance from that first moment, from the moment at which, because though it doesn't say anything about this in the Bible, I mean, there's nothing about Adam and Eve's sexuality in the Genesis story. All it says, in fact, is after the fall is the first sentence, and Adam knew his wife. And the knew was interpreted certainly correctly to mean sexually knew his wife. That was, by many people, interpreted to mean that they didn't have sex in paradise, that they didn't have time. But other people, Milton, as you saw tonight, insisted, no, they did. This is a big debate, but it's a debate that centers around whether there is something fundamentally wrong with the experience. And maybe the simplest way of getting at something that's maybe implicit in your question is that hovering behind both Shakespeare and Milton, and certainly hovering in Augustine, powerfully in Augustine, is an anxiety that there's something inherently violent about male sexuality. And it's about an anxiety about arousal. That hence what to us is the slightly crazy Augustinian reflection on the fact that, well, women can menstruate while their hymens are intact, so there's no reason why they shouldn't have been able to receive the seed while their hymens were intact if the man weren't so violent. And that could only have been possible before the fall. So that is to say, I don't want to maneuver poor Shakespeare and Milton into the camp of Andrea Dworkin, but there is some way in which they perceive there's something wrong with the relationship as they experience it or know it. And they worry about it. They worry about it not because they're worried about the women, they worry about it because they're worried about themselves and their own goodness. That's the best I can do. But thank you for reminding me that I'm brooding
I just
about
want to
this.
tell you also, when you were speaking and reading those last words, I was very sad, and ultimately it's about loss. That story is about loss.
Yes.
And it's just as tragic as that Shakespearean play.
It's true. I mean, look, Othello's a tragedy. I mean, it's meant to make you feel exactly what you just described. And I feel it too. Of all the tragedies, I think in some ways the most unbearable that way. It just is such a horrible loss. But that's not true of Milton. That's not true of Paradise Lost. I think where the end is not, for all of the talk about Paradise Lost, is in the title, I think it's meant to make you feel in a suitably complicated, sophisticated, grown-up way, joyous at human freedom. Yeah. Okay.
First, just thank you for this masterful talk. My question is about the pre-Adamites. And I'm asking this to you as a literary critic. The question is very simple. I mean, if you can have innocence as a reader,
If you want.
if you can have innocence as a reader of a text, when you read chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, you could read it consecutively, as if it's a single story that continues, and the Garden of Eden is a microcosmos. And the pre-Adamites are essentially the people that were created on the day 6, right? That's the theory.
Yes, yes.
Right. And then, I mean, basically God says in like 2, 4, or 5, I didn't make rain, I didn't ask men to till the soil. I mean, of course it's all going to go to ruin. Let's start over. Humanity 2.0, blah, blah, blah. That's Eden. And then, of course, if you read 4, then you realize, I mean, Cain and Abel had to have wives from someplace, okay? Yes. Someone had to inhabit Cain's first city. Yes. Someone had to avenge Abel's death.
Yes.
And only the pre-Adamite theory, this is to say consecutive reading, will make sense of it. Now, neither the religious tradition nor even the modern, documentary theory will say that. Like no one simply reads the story almost consecutively, and as much as Laperriere had
Well,
some
yes,
influence,
yes.
I mean, it's kind of lost.
You have, either because you know the material or just because you are, like Isaac Laperriere, a kind of you're naturally wise, a natural genius. Isaac Laperriere had exactly your experience. Isaac Laperriere was one of those children in Sunday school who drives the teacher crazy, because he said, Cain took a wife from the land of Nod. What do you mean he took a wife from the land of Nod? Where did she come from? I mean, who was that? Who was the wife from the land of Nod? And he founded a city? What do you mean founded a city? And so forth. So the teacher told him to shut up, but he at a certain point didn't shut up. And that experience, as you describe it, of course, was repeated, has been repeated for thousands of years. I mean, that is to say, there are problems, fascinating problems from the beginning. The earliest trace that we have of the story of Adam and Eve is from, the earliest surviving trace is the Nag Hammadi codices, and they say that Eve or the serpent is the hero of the story, clearly. That's from 2,000 years ago. I mean, the problems are recognized as, the problems are, that's what great literature is about. There are problems from the beginning, it's not coherent. That said, just to pick up one tiny strand of what you raised, which is to me completely fascinating, the problem with Isaac Laperriere's theory, which he meant as was a kind of proto-Zionist theory. It was all about returning the Jews to the Holy Land. The problem with that theory is that it not only did it get him in horrible trouble, and it disappeared for a while, but then when it was brought back in the 19th century by slave owners. Right. And they brought it back because they said this is exactly what they were looking for. This is polygenesis. That it turns out that there's lots of different ways of being human, lots of different tracks that lead to humans, and some are superior to others. And one of the strange things, and it goes back to the very first question that I was asked, one of the strange things about our current understanding is that it's not true, that there isn't polygenesis, although this is now, once again, an interestingly debated theory, but that actually there is, mitochondrial Eve, that there is at least some way in which we all actually descend from the same African woman, and that look, they would have held slaves, they would have found out some other justification for it. But it's very interesting and disturbing that poor Isaac Laperriere found adherents in slave owners who wanted to find different strains of human beings.
But we do have other strands of humanoids in us. They're called the Neanderthals, and those are the pre-Adamites, according to essentially that theory.
Yeah,
we have like
yes, but now we get into, as always, into as it is, I'm in territory in which I feel the waters are rising up to my nose and I'm about to drown. And but in this case, in the contemporary arguments about whether the discovery of Neanderthal, for example, DNA, in at least some of us, or in what the status of Denisovians are, this is way above my pay grade. And my understanding is that has not yet, at least, led to the abandonment of the notion that we actually that there was a bottleneck and that we actually came out of this one strand. But don't listen to me, guys. Okay, Andre, can we just have one last question, and then we'll start.
I wonder how you might be able to explain or interpret the difference between the rabbinic view of the Genesis tale of Adam and Eve and that of Augustine, whom you focused on.
Yeah. So the question was, how can one account for the difference between the rabbinic views of Adam and Eve and the Augustinian position? The first quick thing to say is there are many rabbinic positions. So there are lots of, as usual, the Midrash Rabbah, whatever else it is, and it's a marvelous work, the Genesis Rabbah, when it's reflecting on these, is how should we say, not coherent. It's a fantastic conceptual mess, and there are lots of different positions taken in it. Nonetheless, Augustine's position is not taken, and that's interesting. I mean, and so the answer, there are two parts of the answer. In the first place, the rabbis had only a partial investment in the story of Adam and Eve. That is to say, the great story for the rabbis, for Jews, as for Muslims, is the story of Abraham and Isaac, not the story of Adam and Eve. There's, of course, an interest in Adam and Eve, as there is in the Islamic world as well, but the central story to grapple with that possesses the kind of meaning you want to unpack is really the story of Abraham and Isaac, not the story of Adam and Eve. The second thing to say is that the reason for the change has to do with, as so many things, with St. Paul. It's Paul's saying, now Paul must have been getting this from, given who he was, from a Jewish source, and there are certain radical Jewish sources that's like the book of Baruch that suggest something like this. Paul says that Jesus is the new Adam, and what those people who argued against Marcion, and against those people who wanted to get rid of the Adam and Eve story as a incoherent, philosophically incoherent rubbish, they argued, as Augustine argued, look at what Paul says. If Adam is a fiction, a mythic fiction or rubbish, what is to guarantee the reality of Jesus? If Jesus is the new Adam, it must mean that Adam was real. It's the fundamental principle of biblical typology. And the reality of, the historical reality of Adam grounds the historical reality of Jesus. Hence, no Adam, no Jesus. That was the argument, in effect, that won the day. And that's why for Augustine, and for the whole, basically the Adam and Eve story is a Christian story, centrally. I mean, because it's an obsessive concern for post-Augustine, for Christian theology, and for good reason, having to do with the Pauline claim. And what's fantastic is that, as so often happens, is that the most sophisticated intellectual of the 5th century, at least that I know, I mean, someone of unbelievable subtlety, commits himself to a almost impossible task of taking this story, which he had first experienced as completely impossible and incoherent when he was a Manichaean, and committing himself to saying that it's literally true. So he spent 15 years trying to write a book called The Literal Meaning of the Book of Genesis, the literal interpretation of the Book of Genesis, and he failed, Augustine. It's the only thing he really failed at in his life. He couldn't do it because you can't write a literal interpretation of the Book of Genesis. You can get part of the way, but you can't get all the way. And yet he felt compelled to do it. But that's the best I can do. Look, thank you very much for your time. Thank you.